There is a structure rising out of the Wyoming high plains that no geologist has fully explained. It stands 867 feet above the Belle Fourche River. Its walls are vertical. Its top is flat. It is composed of phonolite porphyry arranged in near-perfect hexagonal columns, each one measuring between 6 and 8 feet across, each one running the full height of the formation in parallel lines so precise that surveyors in 1875 mistook the column edges for the seams of constructed masonry. The men in that survey party wrote in their field notes that the object resembled a titanic stone building more than a natural formation. They were not poets. They were military engineers. They recorded what they saw. The Cheyenne had a different name for it. They called it Bear Lodge, or in some translations, the place where bears climb. But embedded in several oral accounts collected by ethnographers in the 1890s is a secondary tradition that does not involve bears at all. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. In this version, the tower is a place of warning, a place where the world above and the world below converge, in a way that is dangerous for human beings who do not understand what they are standing near. The elders who kept this account were not speaking metaphorically, according to the ethnographers who recorded them. They were issuing a literal caution about what the structure does to people who go onto it without preparation. In 1893, 2 men climbed Devil's Tower. Their names do not appear in the official record of the ascent. They are referred to in a single newspaper account from Sundance, Wyoming, as experienced outdoorsmen from the Eastern Territories. The article notes that they intended to reach the summit and return before nightfall. They did not return. A search party found no trace of them on the surrounding ground. The summit, accessed by a later party, showed no sign of their presence either. They were not reported as missing in any federal record. The Bureau of Land Management, which administered the site, has no file on the incident. The newspaper that printed the account published no follow-up. 2 men climbed Devil's Tower in 1893, and the record of what happened to them ends with the first sentence that mentions them. This video is about what that absence means. If you have found this channel, you already understand that the official version of history is a version. It is a selection. Someone decided what went into the record and what stayed out. The question worth asking about Devil's Tower is not whether the Cheyenne warning was superstition. The question is what the Cheyenne had observed across generations of living near this structure that made them issue a warning in the first place. Indigenous knowledge systems are not folklore. They are data sets. They record observations accumulated over centuries and encoded into transmissible cultural form. When a people who have lived adjacent to a structure for hundreds of years say that the structure is dangerous in a way that is not physical, the rational response is to ask what they noticed. What geologists will tell you about Devil's Tower is that it formed approximately 50 million years ago when magma intruded into sedimentary rock and cooled slowly underground. The hexagonal columns formed through a process called columnar jointing, in which cooling igneous rock contracts and fractures along geometric lines. This is a documented process. It occurs in other formations around the world. What geologists will not tell you, because the question falls outside the boundaries of what their instruments are designed to detect, is why the columns at Devil's Tower are so uniform. Columnar jointing produces irregular polygons in most formations. 4-sided, 5-sided, 7-sided columns appear mixed together in basalt flows from Iceland to Oregon. At Devil's Tower, the columns are almost uniformly hexagonal. The deviation rate from perfect hexagonal geometry is lower at Devil's Tower than at any other columnar jointing formation that has been formally measured. No paper in the geological literature explains why. The uniformity of the columns is not a minor detail. Hexagonal geometry is the geometry of maximum efficiency. It is the geometry that honeybees use because it is the shape that tiles a plane with the minimum material and the maximum enclosed area. It is the geometry of carbon lattices in certain crystalline states. It is the geometry that appears in the basalt columns of the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, in the columnar jointing of Fingal's Cave in Scotland, and in the volcanic formations of the Deccan Plateau in India. It is worth noting that each of these sites has an extensive tradition of sacred association. Each one appears in oral traditions as a place of non-ordinary significance. Each one has been described across multiple cultural frameworks as a place where something other than ordinary physical reality is in operation. This is not coincidence. It is correlation. Correlation is not causation, but it is a direction to look. The name that the federal government gave to Devil's Tower in 1906, when Theodore Roosevelt designated it the first national monument in the United States, is also worth examining. The word devil in the name is not original to the Cheyenne, the Lakota, or the Crow, all of whom had prior names for the formation. The word devil was introduced by the 1875 military survey, in which Colonel Richard Dodge translated the Lakota name as Bad God's Tower or Devil's Tower. The deliberate association of a sacred indigenous site with a Judeo-Christian concept of evil is a pattern that repeats across the colonial mapping of North America. But the pattern itself raises a question that the official history does not ask. Why were surveyors and military men so consistent in applying demonic or adversarial nomenclature to sites that indigenous peoples had identified as places of power? The instinct to name something after the devil is not random. It reflects a recognition that the site is unusual. It is a European encoding of the same observation that the Cheyenne were making with their warning. The language differs. The underlying acknowledgement is the same. Now consider the 1893 incident in its broader context. The year 1893 is a significant one in the history of anomalous American events. It is the year of the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where a city of gleaming white neoclassical buildings appeared seemingly overnight, built to specifications that contemporary architectural analysis suggests exceeded the construction capability of the period. It is the year of the financial panic of 1893, in which the American economy collapsed in ways economists still debate. It is the year in which the frontier was officially declared closed by the Census Bureau, marking the administrative end of the expansion program that had reshaped the continent over the previous century. And it is the year in which two unnamed men climbed Devil's Tower and did not come back. The convergence of dates is not evidence of anything, but it frames a question. What was happening in 1893 that made Devil's Tower relevant enough to be climbed? The first documented successful ascent of Devil's Tower was made in 1893 by William Rogers and Willard Ripley, who constructed a wooden stake ladder along one of the vertical column seams and reached the summit on July 4th. Rogers and Ripley are in the record. They came down. The men who went up before the Rogers-Ripley ascent and who did not come down are not in the official record of the summit's climbing history. They appear in a single newspaper item and then vanish from the archive. The absence is the data point. When something is not in the record, there are two explanations. The first is that it did not happen. The second is that it happened and someone decided it should not be in the record. The distinction between these two explanations requires understanding who controlled the record and what their interests were in 1893. The record of Devil's Tower in 1893 was controlled by the Bureau of Land Management, the Territorial Press of Wyoming, and the military survey apparatus that had been mapping the American West since the 1860s. Each of these institutions had an interest in presenting the Western Territories as accessible, governable, and safe for settlement. A disappearance on a prominent geological feature, attributed to causes unknown, would not have served that narrative. The rational institutional response to an unexplained disappearance in 1893 was to not have an official record of it. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is bureaucratic history. Institutions suppress inconvenient events They do it through omission, not fabrication. They simply do not write things down. They do not follow up on newspaper items that create questions they cannot answer. They move on. What the Cheyenne oral tradition preserves and what the institutional record suppresses is the observation that Devil's Tower is a structure that behaves in ways that ordinary rock formations do not. The specific warnings in the oral tradition, as recorded by ethnographers in the 1890s, include several consistent elements. The first is that the tower resonates. Multiple accounts describe a low sound emanating from the formation during certain atmospheric conditions, particularly during electrical storms. The second is that the area immediately around the base of the tower experiences anomalous effects on timing and perception. Accounts describe hunters who camped near the tower overnight and woke to find that more time had passed than they had experienced. The third and most consistent element is the warning about the summit itself, that the flat top of the tower is a threshold, and that crossing it without the proper preparation and intention can result in not being able to find the way back. This last warning is typically interpreted as metaphorical, as spiritual counsel about approaching sacred ground with care. But consider it literally for a moment. The summit of Devil's Tower is a flat, roughly oval surface approximately 1.5 acres in area. It is covered in soil, rock debris and vegetation. It is a defined, bounded space with no concealed exits. You cannot fall off it without going over the vertical edge, which is a clearly visible boundary. And yet 2 men, according to the only contemporary record, went up and did not come down. The search party found no bodies at the base. The summit party found no sign of their presence above. They went through the threshold and could not find the way back. That is the literal version of what the Cheyenne warning described. The Tartarian framework is useful here not because it supplies answers, but because it supplies a different set of questions. The orthodox historical framework asks, did 2 men disappear at Devil's Tower in 1893? The Tartarian framework asks, what is Devil's Tower, and why do structures with its geometric and acoustic properties appear at regular intervals across the planetary surface? And why do they all appear in the cultural record as places where the ordinary rules of physical experience become unreliable? The distribution of columnar jointing formations globally is not random. They cluster in patterns that correspond with imprecise but notable regularity to the distribution of ancient sacred sites. The Giant's Causeway, Fingal's Cave, Svartifoss in Iceland, the Deccan Traps, Devil's Tower. Each one is a place where the rock arranged itself into a geometry that human beings have independently, across cultures and millennia, recognized as significant. The official explanation is that people are pattern-seeking creatures who project meaning onto natural formations. The alternative explanation is that the formations are generating something detectable, something that human beings in proximity to them consistently detect, and that the cultural traditions that developed around them are encoding real observations about what those formations do. What could a hexagonally jointed phonolite porphyry column formation generate? The question is not absurd. Piezoelectric effects in rock are documented. Certain crystalline structures under pressure produce electrical fields. The columnar jointing at Devil's Tower represents an enormous mass of rock that underwent rapid and uniform contraction. The internal stress patterns in a formation like that are not fully mapped. What the rock is doing at the electromagnetic and acoustic level, under varying atmospheric pressure and temperature, has not been formally studied because geologists do not study geological formations for their electromagnetic output. That is not a question their discipline asks. But the Cheyenne noticed something that made them build a warning into their oral tradition and maintain it across generations. The Rogers and Ripley ascent in 1893 was successful because they came equipped with a prepared route and specific intention. The 2 unnamed men who preceded them and who did not return came without that preparation. The oral tradition distinguished between these 2 approaches. Preparation and intention mattered. The tradition was not saying the tower was dangerous in the way a cliff is dangerous. It was saying the tower was dangerous in the way a threshold is dangerous when you do not know what you are crossing into. There is a concept in acoustic physics called a resonant chamber, a space whose geometry causes sound waves to reinforce rather than dissipate. The interior of certain cathedrals functions this way, as do specific cave systems and certain natural rock formations. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The hexagonal columnar structure of Devil's Tower creates, at the surface of the formation, a complex of vertical channels running in parallel from base to summit. The acoustic properties of that structure have not been formally studied. A formation of that geometry at that scale, under the right atmospheric conditions, would produce resonance effects that an observer at the summit would experience differently than an observer at the base. What those effects might do to human perception and orientation is not a question that geology asks. It is a question that the Cheyenne oral tradition answered with a warning. The 1906 designation of Devil's Tower as the first national monument was framed as an act of preservation. But preservation is also a form of control. When the federal government designates a site as a monument, it establishes exclusive administrative authority over access to and interpretation of that site. The narrative about what the site is and what it means becomes a federal narrative. The prior narratives, the indigenous frameworks that encode centuries of observation about what the site actually does, become folklore. They become background colour in the National Park Service brochure. They are preserved in the sense that they are not actively suppressed, but they are not treated as data. The designation in 1906 came 13 years after the 1893 incident. In that interval, the site had become notable enough for Theodore Roosevelt to designate it specifically. Roosevelt was not sentimental about wilderness, he was strategic about it. The National Monument Program he inaugurated was as much about federal land control as about conservation. Designating Devil's Tower as the first monument in the system established a template. Unusual geological formations of cultural significance would be administered by the federal government, which would control both physical access and interpretive authority. What the federal government chose to emphasize in its interpretation of Devil's Tower is illuminating. The official narrative focuses on the geological formation process, the history of climbing, and the indigenous cultural significance presented as legend. What the official narrative does not address is the 1893 disappearance. It does not address the acoustic and electromagnetic properties of the formation. It does not address the consistency of the Cheyenne warning with the observed outcome for the two men who did not come back. It selects what goes into the official story and leaves the rest outside it. It is also worth dwelling on what the word preparation meant in the Cheyenne context. Ethnographers who collected accounts from Cheyenne elders in the 1890s and early 1900 noted that proximity to the tower was governed by a set of protocols that had no obvious religious function in the European sense. They were not prayers or offerings in the way that Christian religious practice would recognize. They were closer to what a modern reader might call calibration procedures, specific behaviors before approaching, specific attentional states to maintain while near the base, specific conditions under which the summit was accessible, and specific conditions under which it was not. The accounts vary in their details because different family lineages preserve different versions of the protocol, and because the ethnographers were working through translators who were themselves sometimes uncertain about the technical vocabulary. But the structural consistency across the accounts is notable. Approaching Devil's Tower was a procedural matter, not a devotional one. You did not go there to worship. You went there when you needed to go there, and you went there correctly, or you did not go at all. This framing is entirely consistent with what the Tartarian framework would predict about a functional installation. You do not approach active infrastructure casually. you follow the operating procedure. The procedure was encoded in cultural form because that is how knowledge is transmitted across generations in oral tradition. But the fact that it was transmitted as cultural practice does not mean its content was cultural in origin. The content may have been operational. The Cheyenne may have been maintaining and transmitting the operating manual for a piece of infrastructure whose builders were no longer present, whose underlying technology was no longer understood even by the people maintaining the protocols, but whose effects were still observable and still dangerous enough that the protocols were kept alive. This is not an unusual situation in the history of technology. There are maintenance traditions around pieces of infrastructure all over the world whose practitioners understand the procedure but not the principle. They know what to do and in what order without knowing why the sequence matters. The knowledge survives because the consequences of not following it are observable. The people who stopped following the protocol at some point in the distant past experienced consequences that made the importance of the protocol unmistakable to everyone who came after. The protocol was then maintained as protocols are, not because anyone could explain it, but because everyone knew what happened when it was not followed. The two men in 1893 did not know about the protocol. They were not from the tradition that had maintained it. They were from a civilization that had arrived in the region less than 20 years before, and that had dismissed the existing knowledge systems as primitive superstition. They climbed the tower the way you climb a mountain, because it was there, and because reaching the top was the objective. The outcome was consistent with what the Cheyenne tradition said the outcome would be for people who approached the structure without preparation. The question of what happened to the two climbers in 1893 will not be resolved by archival research. The record has the shape of an intentional absence. The Sundance newspaper that printed the item has been digitized, but its issues from the latter half of 1893 contain a gap of several weeks in the archive, which is consistent with either poor preservation or selective digitization. The Bureau of Land Management's records from the territorial period are incomplete. The military survey records that would have covered the region are available at the National Archives, but the indexing system for Wyoming territorial records in that period is not comprehensive. Someone who wanted to find the record would have to know specifically where to look. Someone who wanted to ensure it was not found would not have needed to destroy anything. They would simply have needed to not create a file. What remains is the Cheyenne warning, the single newspaper item, the geometry of the formation, and the question. Consider the geometry one more time. The hexagonal column system at Devil's Tower creates at the summit a defined and bounded platform. The sides are vertical. There is no gradual slope. You are either on the summit or you are not. The transition from the column faces to the summit surface is abrupt. The summit itself is a flat enclosed space surrounded on all sides by vertical drops. If you are on the summit of Devil's Tower, there is nowhere to go except back the way you came or over the edge. The two men who went up and did not come back did not go over the edge because no bodies were found at the base. They did not come back the way they came because the search party did not encounter them on the descent route. By physical logic, they should still be on the summit. They were not on the summit. This is the thing that the official record cannot accommodate. Not the disappearance in the sense of men getting lost or falling in an unusual way, but the disappearance in the literal sense. Two men ascended a structure with one accessible surface and no concealed exits, and then were not on that surface when it was examined. The Cheyenne tradition called this crossing a threshold without knowing how to come back. The tradition did not say that people who climbed the tower died. It said they could not find the way back. That is a different statement. It implies a somewhere else to be. It implies that the summit of Devil's Tower is a place where a somewhere else is accessible in a way that it is not accessible from the plains below. The Tartarian research framework is, at its most fundamental level, interested in what the previous civilization knew and built and understood that the current civilization does not. It is interested in the technologies and knowledges that were either lost or suppressed in the transition between the world that existed before the 18th and 19th century resets and the world that was constructed afterward. Devil's Tower fits that framework not because it is a building in any conventional sense, though its geometry is more consistent with construction than with most natural processes, but because it appears to be a structure whose function was understood by the people who lived near it and encoded in their cultural tradition, and that function involves something that the current civilization does not have instruments to measure or categories to accommodate. The two men who went up in 1893 were, in the Tartarian reading, approaching a functional structure without understanding its function. The Cheyenne warning existed precisely to prevent that. The warning was not religious prohibition. It was operational safety information for a piece of infrastructure whose operating principles were not available to people outside the tradition that had preserved knowledge of them. What the 1893 incident represents in this reading is not a mystery. It is a demonstration of what the warning was about. The warning said, "Do not go onto this structure without preparation and understanding." Two men went onto it without preparation or understanding. They did not come back. The warning was accurate. The Cheyenne tradition recorded it accurately and transmitted it across generations because it encoded real information about what the structure does. The question of whether Devil's Tower is natural or constructed is not the interesting question. The interesting question is whether the distinction matters. The hexagonal geometry, the piezoelectric potential of the rock, the acoustic properties of the column system, the reported low-frequency resonance during electrical activity, the oral tradition of anomalous time experience near the base, and the 1893 disappearance all point toward a formation that does something. Whether that something was designed or emergent is secondary to the question of what it is, and whether the people who lived near it for centuries understood it better than the civilization that arrived in the 1870s, mapped it, named it after the devil, and then a decade later lost two men on it without finding a way to account for the loss. The account that does not exist in the federal record, the account of what happened to the two men in 1893, is the most important document about Devil's Tower. Its absence tells us that someone at some level of the administrative apparatus encountered the incident and decided that the incident should not be in the record. That decision was not made about Rogers and Ripley, whose ascent was publicized and celebrated. It was made about the men who went before them and did not return. The difference between the two events is outcome. Rogers and Ripley came back. The unnamed men did not. The ones who came back got a record. The ones who did not come back got an absence. The archive is not neutral. It is a selection made by people with interests. The interest in 1893, as in 1906 and as in every subsequent administration of the site, was to present Devil's Tower as a remarkable natural formation with indigenous cultural significance and no operational function that the current civilization cannot explain. That presentation required the omission of everything that suggested an operational function: the resonance reports, the time anomaly accounts, the specific content of the Cheyenne warning, and the disappearance of two men whose absence the record cannot explain. There is one further dimension of the omission that deserves attention. The Rogers and Ripley ascent of July 4th, 1893 was a public event, advertised in advance, drawing a crowd estimated at over 1,000 people at the base. Rogers and Ripley spent time on the summit and returned without incident. Their success was celebrated and reported widely. The contrast between that event and the earlier disappearance is not merely one of record-keeping. It is one of public staging. The successful ascent was staged on a national holiday with witnesses to establish in collective memory that Devil's Tower was climbable and that climbing it produced no anomalous outcome. The prior incident, if it had entered public consciousness, would have undermined that staging. You do not need to suppress a story once you have replaced it with a better one. What you are left with, if you remove the official interpretation and look at the evidence as a set of observations without a predetermined conclusion, is a hexagonally structured phonolite formation of anomalous geometric precision, situated on a high plain in Wyoming, associated across multiple indigenous traditions with non-ordinary experiences, reported by observers across a century and a half, to produce audible resonance and electromagnetic effects, specifically warned against as a threshold that people can cross without being able to find the way back, and from which 2 men in 1893 did not return, without any physical explanation for where they went. That is the record, the full record, including the parts that were not written down. The Cheyenne knew what they were talking about. They had been talking about it for a long time before anyone from the outside world arrived with a survey instrument and a theology that said the place was the devil's work. The devil was not the issue. The threshold was the issue. The 2 men in 1893 crossed it. The question is whether those 2 men were the last to cross.